How's it, guys? Today I'm going to speak about something I think is super important, and it's about when to use a map instead of an array search. So I'm going to show a few examples where I show why it's beneficial and when you would actually use a map instead of an array search. So let's pretend in a scenario that you have a bunch of users, and a user has a name, a surname, and an email address, and you have a mail that you want to send out, but people may have put themselves on a do not contact list. And let's say you pull this do not contact list from an API, so it's not a database, you can't query or anything like that. You have an API where you've done a call and you've received a list of people you shouldn't contact. So you've got this array of users you want to send a mail to, and you've also got a do not contact list of users you shouldn't message. Now, I'll first run through what I think a lot of the time this function may look like. In most cases, what you would do is you would have your do not or your users to check, and you would filter them, and you would take a user and you would say, okay, well, it shouldn't be on the do not contact list. So we would take anyone on the do not contact list, look at their email, and check if it's equal to our user email. So this looks like pretty good. It's readable, it makes sense. You've got users that you want to check. You filter to see if any of them are on the do not contact list, and if they are, okay, well, in this case, if they are, it would actually put them there. So it would say not. They mustn't be found on the do not contact list. And so now what we'd have is a bunch of users that are not on the do not contact list. And that's pretty cool. But the problem is that in reality, this do not contact list could be hundreds of thousands or millions of records long. And we may have a couple of thousand users that we want to check to see if we should send a mail. Now, if you think about it, if this is a million entries and we have 1,000 users we want to check, and every single time we want to check if a user's on the list, we're going to go through pretty much a million entries. Like, just assume that it won't find the person in the list, or the person is at the end of the list. It will do a million loops every single time. So this is not really scalable, especially for a production system. So let me show you what a map would look like. A map, in this case, it's not really applicable what the map is linked to. It's just whether or not the email shows up in the map. So let's say that in this case, we would put an email, which would be a string, and we would link that to the original user. So we create this map where we run a for loop on the do not contact list, and we go through each one of these and we say, okay, well, the map at the email address should be equal to the user itself. Now, this is still not super optimal, but it's a lot more optimal than the array if you only need to run through this once, right? Because if this do not contact list had a million entries in it, we've run through a million entries right now, and we've created this map. But what's cool about this now is that if I want to filter whether or not I should send to a user, I would run through my users as we did before, but now I would say that it mustn't show up on the map at the user.email location, because if the user didn't exist in the map, this would return false. Now, if you think about this, if I have 10,000 users, I'm only going to have to check the map once for every single user. So yes, I've built the map, and that took a loop of 1,000,000 times, but from that point, I only had to check once. Now, if we go back to the original example, if I have 1,000 users and I have 1,000,000 entries in my do not contact list, and I was just doing a search through an array, every single user, I would search through this array pretty much 1,000,000 times to see if they're there. So this is a huge case where you can see that you get a major optimization by using a map instead of using a search. So let's take this a little bit further, because this is one example, and I think a lot of the time people aren't trying to filter things, but they're actually trying to join things. And that was where I kind of thought of an example where you may have users and you may have had another API where there was additional information that you needed to join on. Let's say that the users that you had on the system, you only had an email address, and you've now just gotten everyone to fill out this form, and all their data has been put on a spreadsheet. It's got their name and surname, and now you need to join it to your user. Now, again, imagine that you have millions and millions of people or users, and they've all filled out this data, and you wrote something like this. You would go users.map. You take your user, and now what you would do is you want to take your original user and you want to overlap it or overlay it with the new user. So you would kind of say, okay, well, what is the new user data? Well, we need to search through this additional data, and we need to find, I'm just going to call it AD for additional data. We want to say that the AD email is equal to the user.email, right? And so now we just go, okay, well, was there new user data? Let's say if there wasn't, then we just return the original user. But I'm being dumb. But if there was, then we want to take the original user and we want to overlap this new additional data, which is the new user data. We want to overwrite anything that is in the new user data. So this looks cool because we've got this user. We check to see if there was additional data for the user. If there was, we overwrite or merge things together. But if not, we just return the original user. Looks good. But as I said before, if we have millions of entries here, we're doing a for loop through millions of users that we have. We then loop through millions of entries every single time just to find whether or not there was data, and this will take forever to run. So what would the alternative look like? Well, firstly, we would create a map again. So let's now take the map. And in this case, before I kind of linked an email address to a user, but we didn't actually have a use for that user. We could have just mapped it to true. Just to explain that a little bit more, in this case, here we could have actually just made this a Boolean. And here we could have just said true. And we would have looked to see if it was true or false, if it showed up in the map. But in merge user data, there is actually a use because we want to take the email address and we want to take any of this additional user information and we want to merge it together. So now we run through this additional data and we create a new entry. So for example, here we would take the email address and we would say it's equal to the additional data. Cool. So now we've got all of this additional data and it's in a map. So how do we merge it? Well, we would pretty much do exactly as was done before, except instead of using a search function, we would now just go, we want to map the user. And in this case, I like to, okay, so let's now go additional user data, and we say that that is equal to the map at user.email. And, or let's just go all this, all right? And then all we do is we return our user and additional user data. And that's it. So you kind of have this ability now to, if we look at this now, we've run through additional data, and if there are a million entries, we've done a million entries into this map, which is a little bit slow to build. But for every single user, if we want to see whether or not they show up in the map, it's just one operation. We look to see if the key exists, or we retrieve that object at that key. And if it does, then we merge it. If not, we just have an empty object. And also I'm being dumb here because we don't have a coalescence in this case. It's an OR. But this is quite useful. I can take this one step further and I can actually use the map type in JavaScript, which I think is a better method to use. Or a better data structure to use. It's faster than using just the standard kind of JSON object. But for this example, I wanted to keep it kind of closer to home, where I think everyone is quite used to having a JSON object, so this makes sense. But we could actually use a map as well. So I think it's just something really important to think about is a lot of the time when we're testing in local environments and stuff like that, we might seed 10 or 50 different objects, and these searches work really well. The .finds work extremely well and our systems work, but when we take it to production and we start seeing proper volumes, thousands or millions of entries, that's when we start seeing these problems pop up. And it's not difficult to code in this way from the start. It's something that if we think about what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve here, when you have to loop through something and then loop through another thing using basically for a search, In most cases, rule of thumb is going to be that you should map that second array. The only time that this may be something where you would overlook it is if you know that there are only a few entries and that search is not an expensive search. So I think it's something really important to consider and keep it in mind. And yeah, I hope this helps you through your coding practices.